Hi, my name is Josh and welcome to The Hard Way. If you're watching this video, you're probably looking at converting a school bus into what we call a schoolie, and we're excited for you. What you may not know though is your choice in bus is actually probably one of the most critical choices you make during out your whole build, because this decision will snowball downhill and decide what your layout can be and how you're going to enjoy it once it's done. There isn't one bus type that will be best for everyone. It's all about pros and cons, what you're willing to give up for your lifestyle. I'm going to go over 9 of the major considerations you should make when looking at buses. I'm in no way a subject matter expert, so I'm hoping that this serves as a stepping off point in your research. If I've missed something, please leave a comment below and tell me what I got wrong or what I missed, and it will better serve the schoolie community. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So number 1 will be bus type. There are dognose, flat, and coach are the major ones you'll see up for sale. There are specialty types, transit buses and things like that, but the amount of people that use those for builds is very small, so let's just stick with the major types. For a dognose, for the pros, you're going to have the classic school bus look that everybody loves and everybody's used to from their childhood. It's just iconic in that way. For mechanically inclined people, they have great engine bay access. You can just flip the whole hood up and everything's right there. You can get to 3 sides of the engine and the top and bottom pretty easy. They also are very safe as far as they have a very large crumple zone in the front of the bus. So if you get into an accident, you have basically with it all loaded up like a 3,000 pound engine block blocking whatever is coming at you from hitting you. And that's in front of you, and you have like 6 or 8 feet of actual crumple that will keep you safe in an accident. And they're also one of the most prolific bus types, so they're also going to be the cheapest. You can find them on Craigslist. Suppliers will have them too, but you'll be able to find one locally if that's what you want. Some of the cons are going to be you have less visibility to the front as you would compared to like a flat-nosed or RV type bus. They do have more mirrors on the front, but still you're not going to quite know exactly where your front bumper is when you're in a tight parking lot as compared to a flat nose where you can just see straight down. You also lose 6 to 8 feet of cabin space because you have your engine up front, so the overall length of your bus is, even if it's 40 foot, that first 6 or 8 feet is going to be taken up with the engine, and it's lost opportunity in that respect. They also typically have a larger turning radius because they can't quite steer as sharp as like a flat nose bus, but that's going to be really brand specific and even year specific and all that. But your wheelbase is normally causing it to have a larger curb to curb turning radius. So dognose school buses can also be much more noisy and hot to drive because you're sitting right behind the engine, and the natural airflow is to blow air through the engine bay and then out and down, or out through some side vents. So you're kind of in the hot area of the engine all the time, and you're sitting right next to it, so it's going to be noisy when you're driving. You also have a much more shallow departure angle. It's basically your clearances at the front and back of how much of an obstacle you can drive up to and clear. And that's going to be really important for getting in and out of gas stations with high approaches on the roads. And when you're boondocking in BLM land or whatever, some of the roads aren't the greatest, and you have to make sure your clearances will work. You have a shallow departure angle, which means that you're likely to drag your back end on things, on obstacles. So something to keep in mind. And you also have a much larger tail swing usually because your rear axle is forward more than it would be on like a rear engine school bus or a flat nose. So it's just something you have to be mindful of in tight parking lots, is your tail will swing out and you can actually hit something with that. So that's dognose school buses. Let's go on to flat fronted or flat nose buses. So for these, the pros are you have the full 40 foot or however long the bus is. You have the full length for your build. So you have that all as cabin space. It's all usable. You also have a full length roof on the bus. So you can add a ton of solar, or you can add a roof deck and solar. It just gives you more options than dog nose, because you're losing that 6 or 8 feet of roof when you go that route. You also have a better steering angle usually, because they're normally meant for city streets, so they're meant to turn really tight. We have a 40-foot flat nose bus, and we can get around pretty easy. So something to think about. And then they kind of look more like an RV when you're done. I don't know if it depends what look you like. That's more of a personal decision or whatever for that. Some of the cons for a flat nose bus are you don't have a crumple zone. So you are literally 3 feet away from the front of the bus when you're driving down the road. So all you have between you and whatever you're going to hit is your bumper and some frame rail. So there's not a whole lot there to absorb and slow down any crash that you're in. So in that respect, you're kind of a little bit more in more of a dangerous situation. But I mean, every RV that's a Class A or Class B is going to have the same layout, and they don't even have like that nice heavy steel bumper at the front. So you're still safer than that, but something to think about. You also normally have very hard to reach access to your engine bay. So mechanics hate working on flat nose vehicles because they are extremely compact. If you have a front engine one, you have this doghouse that's over top of the engine, which is right by the driver's station. So they don't have really good access that way. And then it's only from the front or from the bottom. So there's nothing really from the sides. If you have a rear engine, it's a little bit better. They'll have some access from inside the bus to get to the engine bay. And then they have the 2 side doors, and then they can get from the rear and bottom. So in that respect, a rear engine's slightly better than the front. But yeah, and then if you have a front engine flat nose, you also have this giant engine that's taking up 6 or 8 feet of space at the front of your bus. So it's really, you're not gaining a whole lot over a dog nose in that respect. You're just sitting on top of your engine, I guess. Your stairs are narrower, and you have to work around this giant engine cover that you still need to access for working on the engine. So something to think about there. So because of the flat front on the bus, they actually put the door at the front, which is great for layout, because normally you have it behind the front wheel, but now it's in front of the steering wheel, or the front steer axle. And that causes its own problems where you have a very shallow approach angle where you can't get over some obstacles from the front because your actual stair area or your door area will hit the ground first. So that's something you have to be mindful of. I would say they probably have worse ground clearance overall than a dog nose for that reason alone. So something to think about there. And then the last thing as a con for a flat-nosed bus is that there are fewer available because they don't make as many of them because they're normally only an urban school district type of bus. So there's fewer available, so you'll pay slightly more for them. And depending on what area of the country you are, you're going to have to drive to get one. So you might actually end up having to go through a bus seller like we had to. So that's a flat-nosed bus. Let's go on to a coach bus. So the first pro for a coach bus is a higher weight capacity than a standard school bus. And that is because they are meant to carry a bunch of people, full-grown adults, and their luggage. So they might even have a third axle on them, so they are going to be able to carry basically anything that you can build into them. They'll have the weight capacity for it. They also have taller ceilings because they're meant to be for normal grown adult people to ride in them all the time. So a tall guy like me will normally be able to stand up in them fully. They'll also have much bigger under bay storage areas, so they can throw all the luggage down there normally. So they make for great spots for utilities, and they can be loaded up really heavy compared to if you get a school bus with storage underneath, which is just meant for like a tuba or whatever from the marching band. So they don't have nearly the weight capacity than a coach bus. They also are, because they're heavier, they have much larger engines and they're much more powerful overall. They have full-size semi-truck engines and They can normally go at 80 plus miles an hour also, fully loaded. And that means you can also tow like a bigger trailer or like a heavy pickup or something like that behind the bus. So those are the pros. The cons are primarily they're very expensive. You'll end up paying 3 or 4 times what you'll pay for a bus to get a very used coach bus. They're also normally very high mileage compared to a school bus. A school bus, I would consider it high mileage if it has over 200,000 miles on it. A coach bus might have 1.2 million miles on it when they sell it, because normally those are meant for cross-country traveling all the time instead of just 1 or 2 bus routes a day. So they will be very worn out in that respect, and you'll have to expect to go through all of the suspension, steering, brakes, even the engine and transmission are much more prone to being worn out if you buy a coach bus. And because there aren't as many made, they're much more expensive to work on, and a lot of shops won't even touch them because, especially if you get an older one, they have like novelty mechanical systems on them and novelty suspensions which aren't standard. Like a school bus, you can go to any parts store and get parts for them normally because there are way more of them out there. So that's one of the bigger cons too, is it's going to be really expensive to work on, and you will be working on it because it's really high mileage. They're also higher overall, so if you're not going to do a roof raise in a school bus, and if you're worried about overall height, coach bus is probably not going to be for you. They're meant to be on highway and interstate systems pretty much, so they're going to be, with the air conditioners, they might be the same height as a semi-trailer. So something to think about there. And the last thing as a con is that they are going to be much heavier than a school bus. Because they're beefier, they have the heavier engines, transmission, suspension, the bigger body. They are going to be much heavier overall than a school bus just to start. So that is pretty much a summary of the different bus types. Let's go on to number 2, the length of your bus. So buses will be in a spectrum between probably 12 to 14 foot all the way up to probably 40 to 43 foot. And depending on the manufacturer and the year and the model, it's going to be like basically anywhere in between. So I'm going to talk about short buses as a group and full length long, like 40-foot buses as a group. And the pros and cons kind of start mixing and then switching somewhere in between. So take this all with a grain of salt. So for a short bus, some of the pros for that is that it's more maneuverable than a full-length bus. Your wheelbase is probably the same as a pickup truck, and you can actually probably end up fitting into parking spots for the most part. Now you're probably going to be wider. I know you're going to be wider than a van because you're going to be the full 8 foot or 8'6" wide. So in parking spots, you're still going to be really tight, but it's still more maneuverable than a full-length bus. Because it's smaller, it's also less intimidating to drive for most people. A short school bus will also be much lighter than a full-length school bus, so you'll be able to fit on more of those rural, low weight capacity bridges. But not that that's much of a concern, but they'll be lighter overall, and they will, like going up and down passes, being lighter has its advantages, but at the same time they are less powerful than a full-length bus and have less braking capacity. So it's kind of a wash in that respect as also. Short buses also often come with handicap lifts. So some people like those for like specialty builds, like if they're going to be like motorcycle carriers or something like that. Or if you just want the giant side door. That's something you probably won't find you won't find it in really long school buses, but maybe even in mid-length you probably won't find that option. So if that's a must, then you're going to go for a short bus. They also have better approach and departure angles than a full-length bus because they're more like a pickup truck. So they can get into more rugged areas a little bit easier than a full-length bus. So those are the pros. The cons, it's not enough room for a full like apartment style layout where you have everything that you need, like a full-size shower and bathroom, a bedroom. It's all going to be all in one space. And if that's your lifestyle, or if you're not going to use it for living in it full time, then that will be perfectly fine for you. But if you need to have office space to work while you're on the road and still cook, still have a shower, it all gets crammed really tight in a short length, like a short school bus. And it's just not, the quality of life is not quite that of like an apartment standard, is what I'm trying to say. You also don't have enough roof for like a full solar system where you can run like a desktop computer or big appliances or something like that solely off of solar. So that's something that you'll end up needing a generator probably more often than a full-length bus for that reason. They're also normally a gas engine when they're really short like that. And gas engines, we'll get to that later, but they have their own pros and cons that something to think about. So just not quite up to what a diesel can do. And because it's short too, underneath you don't have much space to add like black tanks or storage or anything like that. You're very limited in that regard. So that's a short bus. Let's go to a long full-length bus. So some of the pros are you can fit a full apartment layout into a full-length bus. You can have a full shower, a bathroom that you can actually change in, I guess, and all that. But you can still have a bedroom and a kitchen and a living room, and you can entertain. So there's different things different pros, I guess, with having a full layout like that. You can also, unlike a short bus, you can have enough solar on the roof to run just about anything, along with even a roof deck. If some people love those, so you can fit that and solar at the same time and not be compromising too much in either regard. Another pro is that you often have 2 emergency exits on the roof, so it's easy to use one for an air conditioner and one for a skylight, or both for a skylight, but you have those 2 access or holes in the roof already. So unlike a short bus might have one, you just have more options there. You also have more room underneath the bus that'll allow you to fit as much junk under there as you want. You can do generators and tanks and storage and still be between the 2 axles when you're doing that. The last pro is that you're going to have a better ride quality overall in a longer bus because your wheelbase is further apart. The bumps aren't quite as, jarring when you're in a full-length bus because you're normally you're averaging it out a little bit better. So it's not a huge difference unless you're on like certain concrete roads. If your wheelbase is just wrong, you'll start bucking and stuff like that, and that's less apt to happen in a full-length bus. So the cons with a full-length bus are kind of the inverse of the short bus. You have less maneuverability, so you have to think about it just a little bit more when you're trying to get into like a gas station or anything like that. Especially if you're towing something that you can't back up with, like a Jeep or something like that. You have to plan out your route very carefully. Also, along with that is parking availability. You're going to be limited to like Walmarts if they allow you in to park there, or truck stops, because you don't have the ability to fit into a normal parking spot. If we are in a Walmart, we'll park across a bunch of parking spots, so we'd end up taking 6 or 8 spots just with the bus. So it's not ideal, and you just won't find as many spots to park with a long bus. Con also is heating and cooling. You have up to probably double the volume of air and walls and ceilings and all that, so it takes double the heating and cooling energy to keep your space at a normal, nice warm temperature or whatever. So you're going to end up spending more money doing that. And they're also, because they're large, they're intimidating to drive for some people. They're also going to be bigger, so they're also going to be heavier. You're going to have to be more mindful about your stopping distance. Bridges for some, depends on what part of the country you're in, but your bridges you'll have to be careful about. And it's just going to take longer to go down big like passes. It's going to be harder to get up with them, and then you have to go slower on the way down so you don't burn up your brakes. So that's another con. And they have probably the worst approach and departure angles. So you won't be able to get into those really off-grid, rugged spots to park with the bus. And then you're also kind of in the same regards, you're limited to bigger gas stations and truck stops for getting fuel, because you can't, either small gas stations it's possible to maneuver around, or a lot of those smaller ones don't have great approach and departure angles, so you end up catching your hitch on the asphalt if your departure angle is too shallow and all that. So those are the pros and cons of a long bus. So you'll have to decide if you want the short bus lifestyle or the long bus, because it's quite different overall. So now that we've talked about overall length of your bus, let's talk about engine placement. Now there are basically only two places that can be, the front or the back of the bus. And let's go over the pros and cons of the front first. So the pros, it is safer to drive because you have this giant mass of metal protecting you from whatever is in front of you. So in the case of a flat nose front engine bus, it's not quite as relevant because it's underneath you more than it is in front of you, but just a little bit safer to drive, I guess. It kind of along those lines, if you have a dog nose, it's easier to work on than a rear engine bus. But if you have a flat front bus, it's not going to be any easier. Pros also, if you're mechanically inclined, is you can hear and smell when something's going wrong mechanically on your engine, much easier than if it's at the back. Some people would probably think that is a con. Something to be said for that. You also shift more of your weight to the front axle of your bus when you have a front engine bus, which gives you more weight capacity at the back for your build and tanks and water and all that. But normally the front axle is rated for much less than the rear axle. So it's kind of a pro, but also kind of a con, depending on how your build goes. So next, having a front engine bus gives you more room at the back. There's just floor all the way to the back of the bus, and then normally you have a nice big rear door, emergency exit door, that you can use for fun things in your build, like a garage or access to your bedroom, something like that you don't get when you have a rear engine bus. The cons, the first and probably most important, is it's very loud compared to a rear engine bus. Your engine is right there, your exhaust system's right there. You're going to hear basically the engine, and that's about it. And it's also going to be hot because all of the cooling effect of your bus is sucking air into your radiator and blowing it through your engine bay and out through vents or down and out. So it's going to be very hot compared to a rear engine bus. Another con that you have with a front engine bus is that your drive axle is the rear one. So you have to have a drive shaft connecting your engine to your rear axle. So you have this giant spinning object that you can't build up against or build around. So your underbay storage and anything you do underneath, like tanks, is very limited because you have not only the drive shaft running through there, but you also have your exhaust system normally running all the way to the back of the bus. Now you could do what a lot of people do and shorten that exhaust and send it out the side, like right behind the driver, but that's still going to be more loud and hotter than a rear engine bus, just for those reasons. So for a back engine bus, some of the pros are your engine sound is minimal. We have a rear engine bus, and our engine noise is so low that it's more annoying to have like a window that has a bad seal or anything like that. You hear that more than you hear your engine, which for me is kind of a con because I'm a gearhead, so I like listening to it. So I have to go by vibrations more than actual sound when it comes to knowing if the engine's running right. You don't get any heat from your engine. Like I said before, in the front engine, you have all that heat. The rear engine, it is starting right at the rear of the bus and blowing all the heat out right away. So it's much cooler inside. We're sitting in my office, which is right above our engine bay, and it's probably only gets 10 degrees warmer than the front of the bus after we've been driving all day long. So for that reason, the rear engine bus is pretty nice. The next thing that I like about the rear engine bus is that because you have that giant cast iron engine block all the way at the back of the bus, it seems to dampen out the giant bumps. Like normally in a school bus, you think about like riding in the back of the bus and you hit a bump and you just got shot straight up in the air. Well, with the rear engine bus, my office, I can leave something on my desk, drive all day, come back, and it's still there. So I don't have any way to back this up, but I'm pretty sure that it's a much smoother ride at the back, especially with air ride suspension on the rear axle. Next pro is that you have a very short drive shaft and exhaust system. So the drive shaft is literally probably 18 inches long, and from a mechanic's point of view, that is about as good as it gets. You don't have any intermediate bearings or long drive shafts you need to balance out, so there's very minimal vibration from your drivetrain with a rear engine bus. And the exhaust system is also like 5 feet long, so you're getting that exhaust basically out of the engine into a muffler and out right away, so it's not radiating heat up onto the floor of your bus the whole length of the bus before it gets out. Also, because your drive shaft is at the back of the rear axle, not all the way up to the front of the bus, you get the whole space between your axles underneath the bus as storage, or whatever you want to do with it. It's free game. We left a foot of ground clearance, and that's about it. So you have much more room to throw stuff in underneath the bus than you would with a front engine bus. You also have much more space by the driver's station than you would with a front engine bus. So the last pro I have for a rear engine school bus is that you normally have at least one side door on the bus as an emergency exit instead of the rear door. And I think the side door is almost more useful, at least in my opinion. So some buses actually have two side doors, one on either side. So you can do some different layouts with that. So those are the pros for a rear engine school bus. For the cons, probably one of the biggest ones is that you're adding a bunch of weight at the back of your bus. So you can't quite have as much of your build weight on your rear axle than you can if you have a front axle bus. But that's just shifting where your weights are going to be in your bus. So it's a con, but it's also not really. So depending on your build. Your layout can also be affected by your rear engine because it has a fairly large engine bay, like a top cover on it that you have to build around, and you also have to build with access to that top cover in mind so that someone can work on the bus if they need to. So like here in our bus, I have this rear workbench that it basically takes up the same amount of floor space as our rear engine bay hump is. So you have to work around it. Most people put their bed at the back, so then it just is a little bit less space underneath their bed for storage. So that's a con. For me, like I said, you can't hear or smell when something goes wrong with the rear engine bus. You're completely reliant on your gauges and your warning system. But some people wouldn't know the warning signs anyway, so it can be a con depending on who you are. There's also not as much mass at the front of the bus to protect you during a crash. Like I said before, in the pros for front engine, you just don't have that weight. There's not a whole lot up front to protect the driver's station. And then the last con I have is that there isn't a rear door that you can use for cool layouts where you have a garage back there or access from your bed. So that's pretty much the pros and cons of the engine placement. Let's go on to the next section, which is the engine type. So number 4 is engine types. There are 2 major types of engines, gas and diesel. And then one oddball that's worth mentioning is propane, because some school districts use that for their buses. And if you're buying a bus, you might end up with that unintentionally. So let's start with gas. For gas, the pros are it's easy to find fuel. Any gas station will have it. So Availability will be easy. If you have a gas bus, it's probably a short bus, so you'll be able to get into any gas station. So there's that. And then the other pro I have for it is it is quieter than a diesel, especially at idle. So you won't bother anybody as much. Slightly quieter going down the road too. So for cons, one of the bigger things is they can't share fuel with an onboard generator like an Onan, which is diesel, or diesel heaters. So you'll have to have an auxiliary tank for your diesel. Some people do that anyway, so then it's not really a con, but it's something to think about. Gas will also have less torque than a diesel. Even if it's a higher horsepower, you won't be able to move as much weight as efficiently. And then they're expensive to rebuild because they're just not quite to the same level of, like a diesel is expected to be rebuilt, a gas is kind of not. So they're almost more of a consumable engine. I don't know, they're not as great to rebuild, I guess. And then they're also not meant to be worked like a diesel. A diesel is meant to be foot to the floor and do that for 12 hours a day. A gas is not meant to be at the max power rating of the engine for extended periods of time, generally. There might be some more industrial gas engines, but those are kind of rare. So that's something that you have to think about with gas. I personally am not a fan of it. I wouldn't do a school bus conversion with gas, but to each their own. I am kind of a gearhead, so I like diesel. So for diesel, the first pro is a diesel engine is much higher torque than a gas at the same horsepower level. They can pull much more than a gas and much more efficiently. Gas engine, you start losing your MPG very fast. A diesel, as soon as you get up to speed, it's going to be more efficient overall. Like with our giant bus build, we still get between 5 and 7 MPG. And when I was starting the conversion, driving it back, I was getting maybe 7 to 9 MPG. So there's not a whole lot of difference from fully empty to fully loaded. Kind of along lines of sharing the gas, diesel can share fuel with heaters and generators much more easily. You have the ability to tap into the tank and use that for like those nice, well, I don't like them, but the Chinese diesel heaters. You can do that. An Onan generator, if you spend the money on one of those, it will tie in nicely. Now, a diesel is much more common, so they're going to be much easier to work on at a shop. More shops will be able to, if you go to a heavy equipment shop, chances are they've worked on one of your engines before. Some of the gas engines that are in buses are a little bit more specialized and might be harder to find parts for now because a lot of them are going to be 20 years old now. So finding parts on those engines might be harder than something that's still in use commonly like these diesels are. Diesels are much more simple and reliable. They basically just need compression and fuel and they will run. That's more so with mechanical diesels, but even with the electronics, they're much more reliable overall. There's no spark plugs, you don't have to worry about that. So, and they're just meant to be industrial engines. They're meant to be worked hard and long, so for that reason they're just much more reliable. And along those lines, they are built to work at their max power rating for extended periods of time. And then diesel, instead of gas, is actually much more energy dense, so you get more power out of a gallon of diesel than you do out of a gallon of gas. Even though diesel's more expensive, it almost breaks even in that regard for your amount of power you're getting out of a gallon. So that's something to think about. And then diesels are much cheaper to rebuild. In the life of a diesel engine, it is probably going to get rebuilt once or twice because it's more economical to do that than to completely replace the engine. So it's common practice at diesel mechanic shops to rebuild engines. They can do it in frame, so they don't even have to pull the engine out, depending on the engine type. But yeah, much cheaper to do that than to get a crate engine and put it back in. So those are the pros with a diesel. The cons are they're noisier, which is just going to be a given. They vibrate more too because it's more mass in the engine moving, and they work at a much lower RPM, so it's just things shake more. So you'll notice that. Diesel is more expensive to buy at the pump, but like I said before, it's almost offset because it has more energy per gallon, so take that with a grain of salt. But diesel is also, in like a full-size bus, you're almost always limited to a truck stop for fueling just because of the size requirements, and most gas stations only have diesel at the end of the islands. You're going to have a little bit more of a challenge finding spots to fuel up, but you take that with a grain of salt also. So that's the diesel engine. Let's go on to the last type that I want to mention, which is propane. So a propane-powered school bus isn't super common, but they do come up on auctions, and especially there's a lot of newer school buses that aren't in like the schoolie community yet. But as they start getting replaced, you'll see a lot more of them. But they basically take a gas engine and retrofit it to run off of propane. There's some definite pros and definite cons with it, so let's get going on that. So the pros, it's much cheaper to buy the propane per gallon than gas, and they claim that these propane buses can get more MPG than a gas engine. So the only reason that they're doing these propane buses is that they're supposedly more economical to run. It's also cheaper to buy the buses after they've been pulled out of a fleet, because there aren't as many people wanting to buy them. So you'll get a heck of a deal on a bus like that. Further cons, you have to fill up at a specialized filling station for propane. These stations, you might not find them in certain geographical areas, so some people end up having to make an adapter to run off like a barbecue cylinder to get them if they get stranded on the side of the road. It's not a great system in that regard. They're meant to be in a school district where they return to the bus shed and get fueled up there. Traveling with them is probably not an option. I think they claim they can get about 300 miles of range on a tank. So you have to, it's kind of like an electric vehicle, you'd have to plan out your route and make sure you have filling stations that are open when you want to be there. So that is a pretty big con for that. And then the last con that I have is not many mechanics are familiar with the system, so they may not want to work on them if you're having issues. You may run into a problem where you're stuck somewhere and all the mobile mechanics don't know how to work on them, so then you're kind of up the creek without a paddle. So that's propane in a nutshell. So with the engine type that you're going to get, I would probably lean towards a diesel myself personally, but if you're in a short bus or if you have a special use case for this, you might go with a gas or propane system. It's up to you. The last thing I want to talk about with engines is different options that you can get on the engines that are worthy of note. The big one for me is having a sort of supplemental braking system. So I'm going to lump them all under engine brake, but there's different terminologies depending on which region of the country you're from. So there's three major types: exhaust brakes, Jake brakes, and then retarder systems. And let's start with the exhaust brake. The exhaust brake basically uses a butterfly valve or guillotine valve that's shot into the exhaust pipe, and it basically puts a back pressure on the exhaust system, and the computer knows not to give it more fuel when it's activated, but all it's doing is it's using your cylinders and your actual pistons to slow your engine down using that roughly 40 to 50 psi of back pressure, and that will actually provide a fairly decent braking effect for like going down big passes or something like that. That's what we have on our bus because we weren't able to get either a Jake brake or a transmission retarder. So the second one, a Jake brake. Basically what it does is it sits on top of your valve train and controls the timing of your engine, and it basically blocks off the valves. It does the same thing but more effectively than a exhaust brake. This is kind of the layman terms. I'm probably getting the terminology not quite correct. It's pretty decent braking system. That's what you find on most semi-trucks. That's like the most common for a bigger engine is a Jake brake. The last one is a transmission retarder system. So what this does is it forces transmission fluid into this vaned disc or flywheel, and it basically puts a ton of resistance on your drive shaft or your output shaft of your transmission, and it is extremely good at slowing down a vehicle. The bad part about that is it gets extremely hot, so you need to have a really good cooling system for your transmission in order to run one. It is something that I've seen on quite a few school buses yet, especially if you find one from a district that has some need for it, I guess. If you can find one of those, that would be awesome. I don't have that on mine. I wish I did. So that's kind of your engine in a nutshell. Let's go on to number 4, which is the type of transmission that you're going to have in your bus. Okay, for number 4, transmission type, I'm going to talk only about Allison transmissions because that's the only transmission brand that I've had any experience with, especially only in the buses. In semi-trucks, Eaton Fuller, I've had some experience, but in the buses, it's only Allison's. So Allison lumps their transmissions in different groups or different series. So they have the 1000 series, 2000 series, 3000 series, and 4000. They might have more, I'm not familiar with that. The 1000, 2000 series, I think they share a lot of parts in common. They are meant for heavy-duty pickups and light-duty buses. Allison 3000 series are for heavy vehicles. I think the 2000 series has a gross vehicle weight rating up to like 26,000 pounds or something like that, so it has to be in a smaller bus. And the 3000 series is in the larger buses, of course. So with the 2000 series, it's more of a medium-duty transmission, so it has a lower torque and gross vehicle weight rating. In my experience, they normally have like a T-handle shifter. They don't have a button display that you can like change your gear and all that. Talking to bus builders and stuff like that and shops, they are not as reliable as the 3000 series because you're asking a lot of them when you get a bus conversion built, especially if you're pushing that top end of the rating. So I would almost steer someone away from it if I was given the opportunity. The 3000 series, especially the 3060 transmissions, are bulletproof in most people's books. They are a heavy-duty transmission meant to up to, I think the gross vehicle weight rating is in the 40 to 60,000 pound rating, so it's plenty for what you're going to work or what you're going to do with it. They have an excellent reputation for durability, and they have a much higher torque rating than a 2000 series. In my experience, they normally have it's a variant of it depending on the year and all that, but it's a push button shifter. And that one's nice because you can actually select your gear that you want. So you can start it, you can push the button and go all the way down to like first gear, start in that one and actually manually shift up as you go or manually shift down. So it's really nice for if you want to have just a little bit of a braking effect going down a pass. You can drop it to like fourth gear. You can choose which gear you want it to be in, basically. The 2000 series, I think you only have the option of like first and second gear as like selectable gears to go into. So you get a little bit more flexibility there, more reliability. In my mind, I would always steer someone to a 3000 series transmission. As far as options for the transmissions go, if you can get it with the retarder on it, it is worth it. They're supposed to be amazing. I haven't experienced one personally. I have a couple friends that have them and they love them. But that's one option you should look at if you have the option. And then the Allison transmissions are normally a 6-speed transmission, and you only have 5 gears available to you. It comes from the factory like that. You can get that 6th gear unlocked. It's just a computer. You have to reprogram the transmission, and then you get that last gear. If you already are going 70 or 80 in 5th gear, unlocking that is pretty dangerous. I changed out my rear end. It's the part that is the final gear ratio before it goes to the wheels. I changed that out for a much more aggressive gear ratio. So my top speed with 6th gear is in the like 70, 75. So I got it unlocked you can find one that already has the 6th gear unlocked. That could be a benefit to you, because it cost me a couple $100 to get it unlocked. So something to look for. And that's pretty much all I know about transmissions. It's kind of their own world of what's good, what's bad, and there's different years that are good. So do some research on that. I'm just going from what I know. So that's all for transmissions. Let's go to number 5. This is the type of suspension you have on the bus. So for the suspension type, there's basically only 2 options for you. There's spring suspension and air. Spring suspension use a leaf spring made out of just sheets of metal. That's not the right term, but metal springs, I guess. And they are probably the most basic or most common. And then air ride is a lot more moving parts, or not moving, but more components to the system, but it gives you a better ride quality. But let's go through spring first and do the pros and cons. The pro that I have for it is it has low maintenance. There's basically just make sure there's not a crack in any of your springs and you're good to go. You might need some grease. It's pretty much foolproof. The cons for them are, though, that you cannot adjust your ride height very easily. So if you load your bus down close to the gross vehicle weight rating and it's sitting lower than you would want, it's really hard to raise it back up and get it to the ride height that you want. It's also expensive to repair because you have to take it to pretty much to a specialty shop or a big truck shop. And then they have to pull the leaf springs out and put a new one in. And the last thing is that it's going to be a rougher ride than an air ride system. It's what you're used to riding in the back of the school bus. It's really bouncy. It's really sharp impulses. An air ride doesn't have that. So that's spring suspension in a nutshell. Let's go on to air. For air, you're going to get a better ride quality overall. Most buses will only have air at the back axle and not the front, so it'll be kind of a hybrid. But some of them are air all the way around, some of them are spring all the way around. An air system will automatically adjust the ride height based on a leveling valve. So it will ride the exact same height fully loaded as it does when it's empty. So we'll adjust the pressure in the airbags and keep the ride height just absolutely uniform no matter what you do. If you put on or you fill up your water tanks, it'll ride the exact same as when you didn't have water in them. So that's one of the pros to an air ride system. It has more parts availability, so if something breaks on it, normally there's a couple manufacturers of these air components, and you can go to a truck parts store and pick them up. It's pretty easy. There's no real specialty airlet fittings from one manufacturer that you have to use. So it's a pretty cheap system to work on. And it's also something you can do yourself if you have just a little bit of knowledge and can unplug and plug in air lines and spray a bottle of soapy water around. You can work on these systems and keep them up and running. Those are the pros. Let's go to the cons. So one of the biggest cons with an air system is that the airbags can blow if you don't keep up with your maintenance and let an airbag get weather checked or damaged. They can blow just like a tire can, and then you lose your suspension on one side or the other, so then you have to either stop right there and replace it or cap off your airline and limp it to a shop. It's not a great thing. I always carry an extra airbag along just in case. So the last con with an air ride system is that there can be more body roll and things are a little bit more not connected between the axles and your body of your bus. There's more room for stuff to shake, and if you go over a big bump, you can roll the body just a little bit more. It's kind of just a different feeling. It's not necessarily any more dangerous or anything like that. So that's your suspension system, pros and cons. Let's go on to number 6, and that will be your brake type. So along with suspension, your brakes only come in 2 major options in buses. It's hydraulic brakes and air brakes. You won't see too many hydraulic brakes in buses. It's only going to be on the smaller short bus type of bus. So for a hydraulic braking system, the pros are you can use them as soon as you start up your bus. You'll turn the key, start the bus, and you'll have brake pressure. Unlike air brakes where it takes a few minutes to build up pressure. So that's one of the pros. And the other pro is you can step on the brake pedal as many times as you want and you're not going to lose pressure. So in an air brake system, you have a very limited number of full brake pressure presses on the pedal that you can do before you need to rebuild your air pressure. The cons are, though, that one failure in your brake lines or one leak can cause total brake failure. That's not the same in an air brake system. And it's not as strong of a braking force as air. And they're harder to work on too, especially by yourself, because you have this fluid that you have to bleed all of the air out of the lines. And it's just not as user-friendly of a braking system to work on. For air brakes, some of the pros are very simple parts, kind of like the air suspension system. The air brakes are basically using the same parts, and you can get them at a local truck parts store. Very simple in that regards. Also very easy to work on. If you get a leak in an air brake line or system, it's fairly simple. Parts are cheap. So those are some great pros. They're also, like I kind of said in the hydraulic brake section, they're very strong brakes. They will definitely stop a larger bus build much better than a hydraulic braking system. So the last pro for the air brakes is that there's multiple redundancy built into them. One leak or one failed brake line or anything like that will not cause the whole system to fail immediately. There's actually, in air brakes, there's two different systems. Normally, there's one system for the front axle, one system for the rear axle, and the only thing that they share is the air compressor that builds up the air pressure, and they're protected from, like if one line were to blow or one side were to leak out, you still have a completely redundant system on the other side, and that allows for much safer brakes. There's a lot of air brake systems in poorly maintained semi-trucks that shouldn't be on the road, but they still are because they have this multiple redundancy built into them. So that's the last pro I have for air. So for the cons for air brakes, the first thing is it takes a long time to build air pressure originally, or initially when you start your bus up. To me, that's not a con because you should let your bus warm up for 15 or 20 minutes anyway, but letting your air will take probably 3 to 5 minutes to build up if you leave your bus at idle. So some people view that as a con. To me, that keeps your engine from getting damaged by using it when it's cold. So another con is there are more components and more things to go wrong on an air brake system because you have relay valves, you have all your brake chambers, you have parking brakes, you have service brakes. There's a lot of more going on with the system, and it's hard to learn what each part does. So that's a con. And then one of your biggest cons, I think, is your braking applications are limited because you only have a certain amount of air pressure on board. Basically, you can only step on your brakes so many times before you have to build air pressure back up. And that's not normally a problem when you're running at higher RPMs, but if you're idling, it will take a couple minutes to build up air pressure if you were to completely use up all of your braking application. But that's very rare that you'd end up using it all, but it's a con nevertheless. So that's pretty much braking systems. There's definitely more you can get into the weeds with any of these points that I have, but brakes are another one of those things where there's a lot to learn about them. I personally prefer air brakes for a bus. They're more suited to the application. So that's air brakes. Let's go on to number 7, and that is going to be the manufacturing year of your bus. So this is going to be, I almost think, one of the more important portions of this. If you get this wrong, it's going to be miserable for you. For manufacturing year, I mean, the newer the better, but you have emissions problems, especially with diesels. This is what I'm pretty much talking about here. Because of the Clean Air Act, as diesels get newer, they had different emission standards to meet, and those emission standards end up really costing a lot of money to work on, and can make owning a bus pretty miserable. So let's start with pre-1994 buses. These are going to be pretty much all mechanical. They won't have a computer on the bus. Your fuel injection's all mechanical. They're very simple. They are very reliable and simple, especially like in the late 80s, early 90s. Diesel engines were at the pinnacle of being purely mechanical. So they'd worked out all the bugs, and they're very strong engines, but very reliable. So if you can find a bus that meets all your other requirements, it's also pre-1994, congratulations, you found a unicorn. If you're not that lucky, we'll go on to engines manufactured between 1994-ish and 2002 to 2004-ish. It really depends on the manufacturer, so you'll have to do your research. So in this age range, they added computer-controlled injection for the fuel system. So they added computers to the engines, which adds a level of complexity, and they are controlling. There's a lot of mechanical and electrical and sensors that go into basically being able to change the timing on the engine in order to burn the fuel more efficiently, which is great, but it comes at a pretty steep cost. These are still pretty reliable engines because they basically just took the mechanical engine and added this electronic component to it. So I'd probably steer away from early 90s diesels, but you almost always want to be like the last few model years before they had to change anything, because they had all the kinks worked out by then. So that's where our bus falls in. It's actually technically an 04, but we don't have anything emissions wise besides the computer controlled injection. So between 02 and 07, they started adding more systems onto the engine in order to meet emissions requirements. And the first of these systems is an EGR system. And what that stands for is exhaust gas recirculation. So what it does is it takes your exhaust gas, which sometimes isn't completely burned, but they're basically putting it back into the intake of the engine and using it again to take out some of the oxygen from actually in the cylinder and actually make the cylinder temperature cooler, which makes it burn more efficiently. But these systems, they take the exhaust gas, they have to cool it down, and then circulate it back in. And if you're familiar with wood furnace or wood stove, where the chimney, as it cools, things condense out of it and there's like a soot or creosote created. It's not the same, but it's similar in these EGR systems, where when it recirculates, these EGR coolers can get plugged up with soot. The other major common problem was coolant from the EGR cooler would leak in and get sucked into the engine and cause problems that way. You're stuck with it. You can't pull any of this equipment off because it is federally against the law to do so. So you have to repair them. The EGR system is cheaper to repair than what I'm going to talk about next, but it's still not fun. They claim it doesn't hurt the engine to put the sooty exhaust back through it and run it again, but I wouldn't want my engine sucking in exhaust and using that, burning it. So I personally don't like any of these emission systems just from a mechanical point of view, because they take something that's really good, this diesel engine, and they make it worse or more expensive to run. So that's 02 to 07. After 07, they added DEF, which is diesel exhaust fluid, and they also added diesel particulate filters. So this is a system that uses this basically urea, and that combined with this filter, which you burn out routinely using more diesel, making your exhaust super hot. It's supposed to reduce emissions even more by basically just breaking up all the soot or whatever that your engine is not burning completely, basically heating up that diesel particulate filter and burning it all out. And it does make the diesels cleaner, but this is where it gets super expensive to repair. They're very specialized systems. I would stay away from anything from probably 07 to 2010, because they're still trying to figure out the system. They had to implement this before it was fully mature technology. Yeah, I would avoid early DEF and DPF, diesel particulate filter systems like the plague. They are very expensive to work on, and they fail more often than the other components of the engine fail, by far. It's also the reason why in military vehicles, it's kind of a sidebar, but military vehicles don't have to have any of the emissions on them. So they get to be a modern engine, but minus all that. So if you do an overlander conversion or you convert one of those, you don't have to, by law, have all the emission systems on it. And you'll get a super reliable engine that, you get all the nice modern day engine performance without the hassle. So, but that's basically manufacturing year in a nutshell. We'll see how the buses age, but I think all the newer buses with the emissions will actually be thrown to the scrapyard much faster than the older stuff. The older stuff will actually hold value much longer. It's the same way in the semi-truck world. Anything pre-07 is almost more valuable than something 07 to like 2012. So that's what I know about all this, being in the construction industry before I did the bus conversion. That's the manufacturing year in a nutshell. Let's go to number 8, which is body features on your bus. So the first thing I want to talk about is door placement. You can have your front door either in front of the wheel well or behind the wheel well at the front of the bus, depending on if you have a flat nose or dog nose. You can have the handicap, you can have side doors, you can have a rear door, you can have the roof hatches. So you'll want to make sure you have a layout that will work with the doors that you have. Some people basically close the door and never use it because they have it framed into something else. I think you want to use them as best you can. Second thing is, and I've kind of hit on this already, is underbay storage. If you can find a bus that has that already, it's a pretty awesome option for you. It will give you some extra storage that you otherwise wouldn't have unless you build it out yourself. I have heard from bus sellers is that they're not designed to carry a ton of weight if you get the ones that are factory options. Like I said before, they're designed to hold a tuba and marching band equipment and go across country with that. They're not designed to throw all your batteries, your water, your gray tanks, your black tanks, everything underneath there and expect it to stay on the bus. I haven't personally inspected one of those really well to see how they're built, but that's what I've heard. Another thing that you'll probably only find on short buses is the handicap door that has an elevator on it. Those are pretty well sought after. I personally know people in the motocross world who like them because they can take their bikes and load them right into the bus. So that's something you want to maybe consider if that's going to be part of your lifestyle. The next thing that I want to talk to you about is if your bus is fully constructed out of rivets on the inside or if it has screws. Our bus had mostly screws on the inside and just a few rivets. And that was much easier to demo and strip than if you have only rivets, because then you have to either drill out or grind out or chisel off the head of each rivet to take it off instead of just unscrewing it. The next thing to think about is interior height of the bus. You might think a school bus is a school bus, but depending on the manufacturer and the year and how it was equipped, you might have different ceiling heights. So you might be able to stand up perfectly fine in some buses, but not in others. But kind of another thing along those lines is if you put any insulation on the floor, you're going to shorten your ceiling height too. So you want to have a little bit of wiggle room or extra head clearance, I guess. And then you also want to look for damage on the exterior of the bus. It's a school bus, so you're going to have people that drive these buses that don't know how to do it that well. So a lot of rear bumpers and rear quarter panels will all be dinged up. That's pretty common. Our bus had some damage at the front, so someone ran into like a tree branch or something, so we had to fix that. Just know what you're getting into there. Inspect your bus really carefully when you do that. And then last point I have is number 9, rust. It's going to make or break your build as far as a longevity standpoint. If you buy a bus from, say Minneapolis or St. Paul, Minnesota versus Phoenix, Arizona, it's going to last a lot longer from Phoenix than it will from Minnesota, and your build will be much easier with a bus from Phoenix than from Minnesota. The major thing that rusts out on these buses is the floor. So most of the buses are constructed with a steel floor, then they put like 1/2-inch plywood down, and then the rubber flooring. So there's not a great way for any water that gets trapped between the plywood and the steel. There's not a great spot for that water to go except for to rust through the floor. So there have been many a build that have been delayed by having to patch the metal floor in the bus because it's all rusted out when they pull up the plywood. We bought our bus from Phoenix. It had the original undercoating all underneath the bus yet, and it was beautiful. We only found rust in the front entry doorstep, but I was cutting that out anyway, so we can basically say we didn't have any rust in our bus build. So be super careful if you're trying to buy a bus up north. My recommendation is to try to find one from Arizona, New Mexico, maybe California, because they will be spotless. So there's a lot of bus sellers that you can go to. You can find rust-free buses, and I would highly recommend that. So if you've made it to this point in the video, congratulations. I hope this information's been useful to you and that it helps you pick out the bus that's right for your build. I will be doing another video of how to inspect a bus before you buy it and what to look for mechanically and cosmetically, and we'll go over that next. This video was a ton of work for me to get all the information compiled and edited and all that. So if you found any value in this video, I would appreciate if you'd give us a like and subscribe. And there's more content like this coming up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.